All right, so good afternoon. Good afternoon. I'm Xiaoye You, the director of the Center for Democratic Deliberation. Welcome to the 2022 Kenneth Burke Memorial Lecture. This annual event honors the legacy of the American literary theorist, poet, essayist, and novelist for which it is named. Kenneth Burke taught at Penn State University Park campus. Not sure whether you know that. And her papers are archived in the Penn State libraries. Relevant to today's talk, there's much in Burke that can be applied to the reign of democracy and the social change. And that his corpus provides the critic with a wide range of rhetorical tools that may help us better understand the symbolic interactions, the dimensions of politics. In his essay, Fascism/Democracy, for instance, he explores a definition of democracy as, quote, organized distrust, unquote, built on recognized inefficiencies in government. Professor Cintron's talk today will be framed through Kenneth Burke's, quote, a way of seeing is also a way of not seeing, unquote, which can be extended to a way of knowing is also a way of not knowing. Dr. Cintron wants to put on the table all possible motives behind the question, is democracy under attack? So thank you for coming today so that we can continue to learn about democracy and rhetoric. I'm honored to introduce this year's Burke lecturer, Dr. Rolf Cintron. Dr. Cintron holds a joint appointment in the Department of English and the Latino and the Latin American Studies program at the University of Illinois, Chicago. His research and teaching are in rhetoric studies, ethnography, particularly urban ethnography, urban theory, theories of transnationalism, political theory, particularly the anthropology of democracy, and the social theory. His early book, Angelstown, Cheryl Gang Life, and Rhetorics of the Everyday, was a required reading on rhetoric and ethnography when I was in graduate school. So I have long admired his work. So I'm really glad to see him here. And his most recent book is Democracy as Fetish, published in 2020 by Penn State University Press. Dr. Cintron's talk will be followed by a Q&A session mediated by Christopher Bean, Managing Director of the McConnell Institute for Democracy and Associate Research Professor of Political Science. He was sitting there. The lecture event will end with a presentation of the winner for this year's Kenneth Burke Prize in Rhetoric graduate essay competition. All right, so now, Dr. Cintron, please. Okay, let's welcome you.
I wanted. Hello? Yeah. Okay. I wanted to walk around. I don't know why, but I just felt like maybe it would be appropriate just to kind of like walk around and talk through these things. So I want to thank everybody for inviting me. Penn State is a very special place for me. I used to visit Penn State as a graduate student when they had their summer programs, their summer conferences. And it's kind of like where I learned what it might mean to be someone involved in rhetorical studies and so on. So this is fantastic. Before I begin, I wanted to acknowledge one of my co-writers. His name is David Bleeden. He's a philosopher. He teaches in College of Law, University of Chicago, also does teaching at DePaul University. He and I have been thinking through a lot of these things now for some time, so there's a lot of thoughts that he and I share. I do not have a tightly structured thesis, quite frankly, with regards to this paper. I see this talk as being kind of like, if I can speak metaphorically, kind of like a public bus. The bus is moving around. There are people on it. The road is very, very bumpy. And so my job, I think, is to kind of point here and there to some of the landmarks that we might call democracy. And I'm hoping that you will point to other landmarks that you might think also qualifies as democracy. I also wanted to say that this is kind of in the spirit of ethnography. I'm very deeply, deeply committed to ethnography. For me, ethnography kind of goes out into the world and it starts speaking to people, all kinds of people. It doesn't care who it's speaking to, kind of gathers their stories, tries to make sense of them. And so this public bus talk thing is kind of the same thing as far as I can tell. Yes, Kenneth Burke. A way of seeing is also a way of not seeing. This is like a little beacon for me, has been for a long time. I've tried to extend it a little bit to a way of knowing is also a way of not knowing. I think ultimately my own thoughts about Burke gets back to the sophistic tradition, and I want to recover that, name it for a second or two. Thinking of Protagoras, Plato's battles with Protagoras in the Protagoras. Also thinking of Antiphon. These were figures who were sometimes known to say to make the weaker argument the stronger. This is the sort of thing that would just be completely outrageous to someone like, particularly like Plato. This made rhetoric sound as if it was equivalent to something like lying, if you could make the weaker argument the stronger. But this is the position that I want to take. This is a quotation from some folks who have written about Antiphon, and I wanted to read this off. So, On Truth ends with the observation that justice is on the side neither of the sufferer nor the doer. You'll recognize Gorgias there, the Gorgias dialogue. Plato takes on Callicles with regards to suffering and doing of justice. But on the one who can persuade the jury, if there is no truth behind the laws of the state, then recourse must be made to nature, a truth known through experience. That is, one must look to probabilities, to what is probable, given what we know from experience. So I don't need to tell this audience that Aristotle links rhetoric to matters of probability, to matters of uncertainty, makes a kind of tension between the problems of certainty, of establishing certainty, and the matter of uncertainty. That becomes the sort of negotiation, I think, that rhetoric is all about. Burke is trying to do that, I believe. But what I wanted to point to particularly was that notion, no truth behind the laws of the state. That sounds kind of peculiar, perhaps. But if you talk to any legal theorist, they'll talk about legal fictions, for instance. Private property is a legal fiction. Maybe that sounds strange. I've argued that in Democracy as Fetish, that it is a legal fiction. Perhaps what's more familiar to you, however, would be something like personhood. Personhood of corporations. Do they literally have personhood? But it's a legal fiction that enables certain kinds of things to come into being. And most recently, there's arguments about the personhood of natural entities that's being mobilized by what's sometimes called the rights of nature claims in law regarding environmental law. So the notion of legal fictions, but this is controversial, very controversial. It critiques a notion of divine or transcendental justice, which was the Platonic vision. Even today, I believe it critiques natural law claims. And if you remember Antonin Scalia claimed to have foundations in natural law. Amy Coney Barrett does the same. My position is that one. No truth behind the laws of the state. So we are caught in the matters of creating probabilities. What's the good argument? Now, it seems to me that if we compared Burke to Protagoras, to Antiphon, that there is something a little more radical in the Burkean claim. A way of seeing is also a way of not seeing. There's something in there that sounds to me like it's an a priori condition. No matter what, a way of seeing is also going to be a way of not seeing. And he seems to be claiming, in my mind at least, that no matter one's experience or one's position, we are in a condition of limitation. We are in a condition of unknowing. And this will become very important for this talk. I will make much of the issue of limitation. And I will try to make much of the problem of unknowing. What's interesting broadly for me is that our claims to know are always claims to overcome our condition of not knowing. And so we kind of keep working within that dynamic. So here are some claims. These are the claims made by Charles Blow, recent New York Times article, 7 Steps to Destroy a Democracy. I won't go through each of these, but you've heard of them. Many of these I'm pretty sure you'll agree with. Charles Blow is coming from the position of the left. I think I am too, but I'm in a kind of a strange version of the left. I might as well admit this. And I want to take up, first of all, I think the first one. The undercount, number of black and brown people in order to skew congressional districts and the Electoral College. I want to do that in part because up until a few years ago, I was chair of Latin American Latino Studies at the University of Illinois, Chicago. And these are kinds of questions that are important to us. The Latino undercount in this particular case, one of the writers of this article, Julie Dowling, is a colleague of mine at UIC in Latin American Latino Studies. Anyway, the whole point here, the argument was that we have a constitutional mandate to count the whole number of persons in each state, whether a citizen or not. That's a mandate. Donald Trump, Wilbur Ross inserted the question to determine citizenship. In other words, are you a citizen? Are you not a citizen? 60 million, that probably affected 60 million people in the country. And the underrepresentation was precisely around 5% as they try to, that's their best guess. Maybe 5% of the population was underrepresented in this category. And possible loss of $3 billion for towns and cities as a consequence. So that's one possible problem in this Latino undercount. Julie Dowling, my colleague, actually works with the US Census Bureau. She is one of the people who come up with the questions that are supposed to ask, the phrasing, and so on and so on. So she is deeply immersed in these kinds of questions. I have a couple of replies. These are some of my colleagues. Nena Torres, she works quite a bit with the Cuban population. She has a lot to say about this. Geraldo Cadava works at Northwestern. Michael Rodriguez, I've known Michael since he was an undergraduate, but he's now a professor at Northwestern. All of them have written about issues of the Latino voter. One of the curious things is that all of these folks will say that when you look at the sort of popular myth about Latinos in the United States, there's a kind of an essentialism which is going on. Latino vote turns out to be far more conservative than most people think. In my home area, South Texas, I've heard all my life, and my life is now getting older and older and older. All my life I've heard questions, problems, demeaning the undocumented from the Mexican American population, undocumented. I've done a lot of research with the undocumented. You wouldn't believe some of the things that the undocumented say, actually. They might as well be a right-wing Trump supporter. I agree about the problems of being illegal. These are all sorts of things that are not very many people know about. Perhaps we should, in some fashion or another. The sort of conservatism which occurs in the communities which are studied. There's always a kind of a disconnect, it seems to me, between Latino studies and the communities. But if you get involved inside the communities, you hear all kinds of things which are maybe a little surprising. But I want to go further. It strikes me that if we go back to those 7 things that Charles Blow is talking about, there's a presumption there, which I think underlies so much of the conversation that I'm trying to get started here. There's a presumption that democracy, to a certain extent, is a significant measurement problem. That if we can just rejigger the system in some fashion or another, in the name of equality, equity, fairness, etc., if we can just jigger it, we will produce the sort of democracy that is part of the dream world that we all have. That in some fashion or another, we will create an inclusion which does not exclude somebody. And I'm going to make a very strong argument. I'm going to say literally that every inclusion is someone else's exclusion. And I don't know that we can ever get around that. I'm going to make the claim that every intervention causes harm to someone, somewhere. And so this whole rejiggering sort of thing that we may kind of imagine, if we can just correct the gerrymandering, if we can just correct the undercount, will produce the sort of imaginary that we hope to produce. It's an assumption. Democracy then becomes like a managerial modernity. It looks like a kind of neutral instrumentality of some sort or another. What's interesting is that I think the socialisms, communisms, anarchisms, fascisms, all of which were part of the landscape of modernity, inventions of modernity, those too are managerial systems. What's interesting to me is that they do not necessarily pretend to be neutral. In other words, if equality is your value, you shove it in there into the body politic in some fashion or another. But with democracy, there seems to be a kind of neutral instrumentality sometimes that we think can be done if we intervene properly, correctly, and so on. So this gets to the big issues that I want to get at. All modernist political orders share a common goal: the release and management of potentiality. I think this is huge. What I want to say here is that if we think of nature, let's say we're thinking of nature in the 1600s, 1700s, if we think of nature as something to be used, as a resource, if we can just harness it, we can release it. What that amounts to finally is the mastery of nature. At the same time, we're thinking about the human. And so freedoms, rights, liberties, equality, what I call the democratic rhetorics, are part of that mastery of the human potential as well, releasing human potential through those modes. If we think of the machine, potentiality of the machine, what drives the very notion of progress, release the potentiality of the machine. Machine has tenfold power, let's say, of the human. We have even more potentiality on behalf of the human. Economics, of course, private property, the distinction between public and private, which is something kind of working along with David Bleeden right now, on that, when that distinction begins to emerge. The legal fictions that I merged earlier, the notion of the free market, all of these are forms of releasing potentiality. And that's why neoliberal, ordoliberal, distributive forms of economic distribution and so on. I do not get so much excited by the critiques of neoliberalism. To me, it's another form of managerial modernity, and most systems, most governments have a toolkit. Neoliberalism over here, Keynesianism over here. And they do the jiggering. They jigger one way, they jigger another way in order to produce something, in order to respond to something. Yes, they're fraught with all kinds of political beliefs and values, but it's all part of that managerial modernity landscape. A definition of techno-positivism: the idea that science and machines, technology can grasp the physical world as it is in order to solve all problems and maximize human flourishing. Again, the notion of potentiality. So ultimately, I think of this as growth, the management of growth across all of these domains: political, economic, technical, certainly addressed to things like nature. So if we think of it this way, if you're at least beginning to entertain this notion of managerial modernity, then obviously some problematics begin to appear in my argument. Are massive societies manageable? My first answer is probably not, at least not in the way that we hope it can be managed. Can we manage GDP growth as one realization of potentiality, for instance? If you follow a libertarian argument, no, you should not manage it, just let it rip. If you're more progressive, you want to manage growth because you want to distribute potentiality to everyone in that fashion. So these contrary ideas about management begin to create problems in the managerial system itself. Are the masses representable? And if they're not, then potentiality might not be realizable. And what I mean by representable, for me, and this comes from my field work, all right, so let me kind of talk about it from there. We have the representative. Can the representative in a city like Chicago with a ward that has 60,000 people, 75,000 people, 80,000 people, however number it has, can that one representative represent 60,000 people? Impossible. And so the few are representable, much easier to represent a few. And when those few do not feel that they're being represented, some other group kind of emerges to try to get represented. But I think this becomes the start of alienation in some sort of way. I don't feel represented. I just don't feel represented. And where I do work, what's interesting is I've been working 2 decades in the Puerto Rican community around Humboldt Park, Chicago. We've managed to get control of the representation. We control the 4th Congressional District through Chuy Garcia. We control the representatives of that area downstate in the Assembly. We control the Senate. We control the aldermanic offices locally. So control for us does not mean the oligarch or the lobbyist is controlling the representative. In this particular case, it's constituents who are fairly marginalized in and of themselves have managed to get control. But it's the same problem. We do not necessarily want, and here's one group that is contending with us, the gentrifiers, who are largely white, who are interested in development, who are interested in property values skyrocketing in the city so that they can get more profits. And the city is also interested in that because it wants taxes. And so we oppose that, and we keep them out, quite frankly, through all kinds of means. So that's the sort of battle, eventually, that democracy becomes. But other groups do not get represented as a result. So this is quite important to me, limitation, limitlessness. I would call this the architectonic of modernity. It means a kind of like a foundation to modernity itself. To me, this is the telos of democracy, the constant need to jigger and rejigger the system. Overcome limitation, whatever it is that we might call it, say an injustice in order to create a justice. And it's through this kind of mechanism that democracy keeps pushing in one direction. The issue is that it can push in the right or it can push in the left. And it's kind of difficult. Who is it? Does the right have particular control over a particular moment, or does the left have control over it? Here is the pursuit of justice in my estimation. The proliferation of justice terms. Social justice, environmental justice, reproductive justice. All of the justice terms that you can possibly imagine. So injustice then is the limitation, and justice is the overcoming of that limitation, and we sometimes call that freedom. So that dynamic between limitation, limitlessness, again, I'm trying to push here the notion that this is the juice that gets, democracy moving. All the time, to go back to Antiphon for a second, no truth behind the laws of the state, no natural law of justice. It's the fight. It's the interpretation. You are unjust in one instance, and they can turn it right around and say, no, you are the one that's being unjust. I have lots of stories that I can tell you about that one. So as a result, justice to me is, again, not that divine transcendental thing, but it's a storehouse of social energy. Whatever it is that it can corral, it's that social energy that kind of pushes things. The problem, I believe, that democratic rhetorics, they function as God terms. For me, the democratic rhetorics, liberty, freedom, rights, become the sort of God terms. This is a Burkean conceptualization. At least God terms were Burke's conceptualization. I apply it to the democratic rhetorics. I think of them as God terms. They're absolutist terms. They're virtue terms. In other words, they have a sense of unassailability. If I have a cause, and I can link it to freedom, to rights, if I can link it to justice, then I've started to create a kind of unassailable position. I've started to say, I am on the side of the good, the right, the truth of the matter, and so on. And so the rush to identify with justice, and if we identify with justice, then by implication, those who don't identify with me become identified with injustice. We're going to get to a lot of this over time in this talk, and we'll see what kind of problems that creates. And then, of course, always waiting in the wings is the other group getting ready to seize their cause and to link it up with justice. So there are things that I personally would not believe in. Justice for the unborn, justice for displaced cold workers. So I'd rather be on the side of justice, environmental justice, for instance. But it's just a matter of time before these other kinds of justice claims occur. And that's my whole point, the antinomic body politic. Located in truth claims, ontological claims, foundational fundamental claims. This is the truth of the matter, and you're not. And that's a breakdown of the word anti-nomos, nomos laws. This comes from a Republican organizer during an interview published in the New York Times. Anyway, here's an example of it. There's a good CNN poll on this that asks, do you think American democracy is under attack? 46% of Democrats said yes, 46% of independents said yes, and a full 66% of Republicans said yes. That's because Republicans labor under the delusion that the 2020 election was stolen. So they are the most concerned about democracy. The people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th thought they were fighting for democracy. So democracy can be kind of an opaque term for voters. Yeah, it's an opaque term for voters. It gets seized by whatever group you want. So who is under attack? Okay, let's deepen this. Oops, not quite yet. Let's deepen this. January 6th, 6 p.m., the riots have occurred, and Donald Trump tweets. Notice the language. These are the things and events that happen when a sacred landslide election victory. Sacred. I mean, we're back into we're back in the train of the God term, the absolutist term, the truth term. So a sacred landslide election victory is so unceremoniously and viciously stripped away from great patriots who have been badly and unfairly treated for so long. Go home with love and in peace. Remember this day forever. There's a lot in there, but this is my whole point, or this is one of my points, certainly, that if you genuinely believed that democracy was taken from you, then you felt that democracy was under attack, but you're saying that from the right wing. On the other hand, the left wing wants us to believe that democracy is under attack from the other kind of perspective. How do we settle that kind of a dispute? Well, I mean, you can always say, well, they were deluded, it was false, but what if you really believed it to be true? What if you foundationally believed it? And this becomes the perplexing sort of thing, I think, that all of us, kind of face when we enter into these kinds of problems. I think ultimately what this kind of refers to, Trump was using throughout his campaign, was using the forgotten man trope. So he was reaching into the sense that, all right, you were involved in a sacred cause, but somehow or another you have been disabused, you have been ignored, you have been rejected, you have been forgotten in the liberal imaginary, all right? And what he was reaching for was a politics of grievance. But I would say that the politics of grievance is central to democracy. It's the fuel, again, that drives the democratic advance for both the left and the right. The left has its grievances. Grievance also, in fact, it begins to look like a kind of fundamental right. In other words, that democracy says, you have a grievance, you have a right to your grievance. Because it's your grievance that's going to push us even further towards the truth of whatever it is that democracy is supposed to represent. So grievance becomes the limitation, in my analysis at least, and it compels us to find a limitlessness, a solution, something that will free us of that grievance. And again, I think this is the telos of democracy, to actually grant us the right to have grievances. And that, in a sense, is problematic. On the other hand, it's quite potent. Dissoi logoi, counter-arguments, the famous piece. Some people think that it was influenced by Protagoras. My argument is that all of our arguments are premises. They are groundless grounds because they can't be proven. And in this determinacy, we create a kind of poiesis of manufacturing things, inventing possibilities. It's also world making. We create the worlds that we eventually want to make in some fashion. It may look left at one point, it may look right at another point. But this is part of the dynamic. I had a quotation, it's going to be too long, I'm not going to read it. But on that paradox of equality, it's interesting, going back to American Revolution, Thomas Paine, talks about equality in terms of competition. In other words, if you bring down the aristocrats, you now have the people. Now that means competition. That's an interesting interpretation. The left wants to say that competition is part of the problem. What competition does is, at some point, it diminishes people. But Paine was saying, no, equality is a matter of competition. It opens up competition. So what's equality? Is it the release of competition in the name of potentiality? Or is it a kind of distribution of resources, as the left would want us to believe? How do we eventually decide which one is the true vision of what equality might be? One of the ways to think about this is that democracy warrants verticality, but it also warrants horizontality. So what I mean by this is that the right to verticality is the promise made to horizontality. In other words, be all that you can be, make of yourself what you can. This is the promise that we make to, let's say, to the masses of people. Hence, democracy is troubled when it restrains self-interest. How do you restrain self-interest and still hold on to that notion of releasing the potentiality of the horizontal? Becomes very, very difficult. And so we seem to warrant both a kind of the rise of an oligarch, the rise of a powerful person, the rise of at least a rich person. We seem to guarantee that. We give a warrant to it. At the same time, we warrant the virtue of, the horizontal condition. But anyway, the rise of the oligarchic condition is something that is guaranteed. And that is part of the problem. How do we restrain when somebody has taken too much? How do we restrain that? We have difficulty justifying the restraint. We have difficulty saying tax rates at 75%. We have a considerable amount of difficulty because when we say something like that, we seem to be contradictory. The very notion of democracy as being a kind of horizontal kind of thing, which gives us the promise to rise to the level of wealth. So for me, then, democracy, I try to understand it here as a ratio. There is, at the same time that there are horizontal forces, democratic forces, there are oligarchic forces. And we can never quite settle what that ratio will be at a particular point in time. And they will shift over time. They will shift in terms of the different sectors of the society. Remember when I talked about the Puerto Ricans, say, in Chicago? In a sense, in marginalizing other kinds of forces, they have created their own oligarchic power base. But it's the people, it's not an individual, it's the people. But it's the people within this particular group that have managed to get control, and I am in sympathy with their group. But there are other Puerto Ricans who are not in sympathy with us, who would just as soon make as much money because they own property, would like to make money off of gentrification. But we stop them from making money off of gentrification as much as we possibly can. All right? So, fetishization of democracy. If we think democracy is the kind of abstract ideal and that it is open to all premises, for instance, open to all worldviews, then we have started to fetishize democracy. And that to me begins to erase the oligarchic condition that I tried to argue a second ago. In other words, the fetishization of democracy emerges when we think that democracy is identical to the horizontality, that it doesn't somehow or another warrant verticality. So my argument is that it always warrants verticality. So deterritorialization versus territorialization. When we territorialize democracy, then the ruling premises are in charge, and not all premises can coexist. Every inclusion is someone else's exclusion. Every intervention is someone else's harm. And at that moment, then, democracy is no longer, democracy cannot simply sit out there in the abstract. It must be territorialized into real-world conditions. And rather often, those real-world conditions are determined by the nation-state itself. And so then democracy bends to the will of economic growth, for instance, in the name of releasing potentiality. Or it bends to the will, or it allows for the privileging of the citizen and the not privileging of the non-citizen. Because the nation state says that it must do that. It must privilege the citizen. And in this particular case, then Trump, in that way, in privileging the citizen, was working within a territorialized version of democracy. It's not as if it was all that outlandish, that we owe to the citizen the first set of resources before we do anything about non-citizens. These become the contradictions which I think are unresolvable, and we don't know how to finally deal with them. Almost all of my work is on behalf of the non-citizens, or the undocumented. I've written a lot about that. But I've also interviewed all of those folks who are resisting the undocumented, who in fact are resisting immigrants. And I think I've come to understand their worldview. And I think I've come to understand where they're coming from. And I think I've come to understand how they frame themselves as being ultra-democrats. In other words, that they are preserving democracy in their view, or they're preserving the nation state. And it's not as if these arguments are ridiculous in their minds. They make their own kind of argument. It works within a specific kind of set of premises. It's not the set of premises that I accept, but we talk to each other anyway. So, I think, again, the fetishization of democracy, the problems of territorialization, deterritorialization, are all part of the problem. Now, this is interesting. This comes from a professor of American Studies at George Washington. And I'll just read a few things. The ugly freedoms in American politics today increasingly justify minority rule, prejudice, and anti-democratic governance. If we don't push back against their growing popularity, we'll have ceded what freedom means to those who support monopolistic rule and furthered the country's downward slide toward authoritarianism. And this is a standard set of arguments. I certainly, in one sense, I certainly agree with her. But here's a problem. This comes from Ann Phillips' Unconditional Equality. I really highly recommend it. It's really quite a good book. And I think if you read Unconditional Equality, you come up with the sense that Anchor is also working with particular kinds of premises. So here's a premise that she's making, Anchor, the other person. Can we cleanse the body politic of false premises? Can we ever do that? Are those who hold false premises marked as unworthy? And so here's Ann Phillips' argument. Those who are most alert to the failings of right-wing nationalisms and populisms fall into a kind of anti-democracy that points to differences in knowledge or experience or intelligence as relevant considerations in assessing who is entitled to a political voice. Equality is not conditional on any of these and is not something to be withdrawn if people fail to meet the conditions. So, does the left thesis require moral outrage and a demeaning of the right when we critique the January 6th protesters, for instance? And if that is true, then where is the unconditional equality that we might want to grant to everyone? And if we do not grant unconditional equality to something like QAnon, if QAnon is unworthy, in other words, have we stumbled into a kind of anti-democracy? Is this the arrogance of the left? So where is the attack on democracy? Is the attack of democracy coming from the right, against, say, the Capitol building, against democracy? Or is the anti-democracy coming from the left in a kind of a curious way, if we're going to demean the right in ways that do not grant a kind of unconditional equality? These are tough questions. I'm going to pretty much wrap it up pretty quickly here, because this kind of moves into the sort of work that I'm kind of currently doing. This is coming from Amitav Ghosh, The Great Derangement. Climate change poses a powerful challenge to what is perhaps the single most important political conception of the modern era, the idea of freedom, which is central not only to contemporary politics, but also to the humanities, the arts, and literature. Non-human forces and systems had no place in this calculus of liberty. Indeed, being independent of nature was considered one of the defining characteristics of freedom. Okay, so as quickly as I can. I made an earlier claim that freedom is an apparatus of managerial modernity. I said that it is not substantive. There is no freedom as such. There is no freedom, there is no thing in itself about freedom. It's a premise. It's a groundless ground that cannot finally be proven. It may generate a lot of things, but in the name of certain hands, it can generate some awful things as well. So what is freedom? Ghosh suggests that it is one of the essences or defining characteristics of modernity. And in one sense, he is right. And most moderns would agree. Freedom from here, if it is something that's going to be lost, is substantive. It's not a mere metaphor. It's not a name. It's not just an artifact of language. In fact, people who die in the name of freedom do not think of freedom as simply an artifact of language. They put their lives down and they die in the name of freedom. So for them, freedom is very, very substantive. Ghosh captures, I think, a theme that is really quite pronounced in German idealism, German idealist philosophy. Freedom from necessity, which is equivalent to the release of potentiality that I was trying to talk about. So necessity equals limitation, back to my language. And freeing ourselves of necessity is to realize the potentiality of the human. This is another way to talk about the mastery of nature. And it's here. In many ways, the problems of climate change are due to a kind of over-mastering of nature on behalf of human potentiality. And that's part of the problem. The democratic rhetorics are a mastering of the human condition because they deliver at last the fulfillment of human possibility. So this is modernity. This is its dream world. This is the phantasmagoria of modernity. And the question that I'm asking, and perhaps you think I'm coming from a strange place in critiquing the democratic rhetorics, but the place that I'm coming from ultimately is, can modernity, with limited resources, with resources that it has used up, can it continue? Can we continue the sort of mastery kind of thing that we have been working with? And so what about freedom? What about liberty? What about rights? At what point does all of that language simply become a kind of conspiracy along with the using up of nature in the name of the individual or in the name of a nation? How long can all of that persist? So I think Ghosh is correct here, raising some fundamental questions about our entire vision of democracy, about nature, about the use of machines to increase the human potentiality, and what is the future. So my final slide. This is what we're working with right now. Tentatively titled The Ages of Volatility. So modernity as a moment of volatility, in which modernity is seen as that moment when volatility enters into the entire structure of being and encounters today the apotheosis of volatility, the revolt of the planet. I think I'll end it here. I have one more slide, but it's going to take a while. Maybe I'll show it to you, but let's leave it at bay for the moment. So anyway. Okay.
I'll try to turn this on. Give me 1 minute to get this. Can you hear me? Well, it says it's on. Yes, yes, yeah. Okay, great. Okay. All right. Xiaoye's got a microphone, and he's going to be, if you raise your hand. Thank you. That was really provocative and interesting. While everybody kind of thinks, I want to see where I've got questions if they're coming in online. So I have two questions, and I'm not sure which one to ask you, but I'm just going to pick one. All right. There are a lot of words in your. Hold on now. Wow, this is really a meta thing. I'm hearing myself through my computer. Let me turn that off. Okay, sorry about that. All right, so there are some words you use that express a kind of solving of problems or a kind of reach a solution. So you talk about cleansing and achieving and things like that. And I just want to raise the idea that there is within political theory, democratic theory, a pretty well-established position that they recognize that those aren't possible, right? That's right. And so you have, I'm thinking of Shklar saying, forget about justice, just stop cruelty. That's all we can do. And Reinhold Niebuhr says that politics is proximate solutions to insoluble problems. And I think you get at that with this idea that there are ratios, and the ratios are always changing. But I guess what I see with them is this they're kind of They're able to live with that. And I'm wondering where you come down on that question, of whether or not what is required is not so much lowering our standards or our objectives, but just recognizing that there is no end to this game.
Yeah, that's very much close, that's very close to my own position. I think the problem is, where do most people sit on these kinds of questions? Where do the masses sit? For instance, when I was showing that unconditional equality argument, I don't think that Ann Phillips, for all of my admiration for what she's doing in that work and for offering us a term like unconditional equality, which really resonates, I think. I don't think that she is kind of taking seriously the sort of stuff of the world in which people literally want to align themselves to some sort of truth value or another. And so the proliferation of justice terms, I think, kind of comes out of that. Or as we were talking earlier, the proliferation of freedom terms, for instance. So is it left freedom that we're supposed to adhere to, in some sort of magnificent sort of way, and the masses will rise up and become free? Or is it right-wing freedoms that will be, at the service of libertarians or something like that? Or you simply can't tell me what to do, those kinds of freedoms. So I think we're in this vast battle between these contending virtue terms, between these contending God terms, and we want to side to the ultimate truth of our particular position. And that's why when I try to say, well, these terms are not substantive, right. In fact, they're profoundly empty, they're almost like empty vessels, and then we fill them up with our convictions, our passions, our truth claims, then we start to enter into the sort of problems of, is democracy under attack? And the left is going to do that against the January 6th folks, but the January 6th folks can reply, well, yeah. We were the defenders of democracy. Interesting. How do we resolve that? I'm okay with even the contention. I'm okay. In fact, I kind of enjoy contention.
Right. Well, it's kind of inescapable, right? Right. Anybody want to jump in? All right. Do you? Let me get this question from online. How do we change our politics from us against them to we for each other? Yeah.
I don't know. Through some set of enormous transformations
that are not at this point foreseeable or even imaginable.
Very difficult. I think there's, we were talking earlier, I think at lunch or something like that, about some kind of internal work that's kind of necessary, a kind of inquiry into who we are as passionate human beings and the sorts of claims that we want to stake our flag on. So there's internal work that kind of gets there. But I do think there are also external kind of possibilities. We can find out where, and this is this to me is kind of like the brilliance and the ethics, if we want to call it that, of ethnography, right? If I want to talk to the right wing, if I want to talk to militia groups, then I have to be willing to listen, and I have to be willing to find a common ground. In all cases, I have found a common ground. And oftentimes it's matters of, again, as we were talking, oftentimes a matter of class, in which some group, let's say the right wing, at least the folks that I talk to anyway, feel that the rich folks are doing a number on them. The left feels that way quite often as well. So are there common grounds? And I think in small scales, yes, we can find common grounds.
Are there common grounds around understanding, or is it possible to find common grounds around these understandings of these God terms? Or is it something less than that? Something, not quite as ambitious as that? When you're talking about class, right? You are talking about conceptions of equality.
Yeah, you are. Yeah, you are. Yeah, that's a curious one. Equality, I think, I can only reflect again on just talking to folks. And this kind of gets us to the social justice problem, to the equality problem. Okay? And this is kind of like a famous story for me, because I've never forgotten it. So I go in to talk to one group of people, and they, we're talking. All of a sudden, the person says, "You're one of those social justice types, aren't you?" And I say, "Yes, I am." And then the person says, "Why do you folks stick the word justice? No, excuse me. Why do you folks stick the word social in front of justice?" I'm going to tell you why. It's really preference. That's what you really believe in. That social means this minority over here, or this unprivileged group over here. They're the ones that you're trying to alleviate their problems.
Right.
You're not listening to my problems or to our problems. That's really kind of curious. So we can use justice all over the place, right? Mm-hmm. But then we're back into the politics of grievance. You have done something for them, that's what you really believe, and you call that justice. That doesn't sound like justice to me, says the person.
So how did you answer that?
Well, I did not answer that all too well, because that's the moment where you try to say, no, I believe in inclusivity. And that seems to say, oh, really? So who's going to get excluded in that inclusivity?
Right. Which kind of makes your point.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think we're trapped in the language itself. And maybe that's why I'm in rhetoric.
Well, as someone who's not, there's a question. Let me just get why you, no, go ahead. You go over there, and I'm just going to, for somebody in politics, the argument would be that we accept and we use these God words, but we also accept and recognize that that their status isn't as big as we make them to be. We need to make them that big because we're not going to get to the barricades without them. Yeah. But we have this kind of two-sided thought that at the same time, we recognize that there are other claims that are also equal to use of those words. Yeah. Do you buy that?
Well, I think so. I mean, here's a problem with myself and with the academics in general. The problem, this is this sort of, it seems to me that my position here where I can kind of, work through all of the complications, or at least what seem to be the complications of public discourse, and so on, and say that, there isn't really substance, behind these terms. There's something from that other perspective that's an elitist view of things. And so now the academy becomes this site of elitism. Oh, you folks, you're so up there in the ivory tower, looking at the misconceptions that are floating around, the ontological untruths that people adhere to. But those are truths that I really believe in some fashion or another, and you're demeaning me by saying that they're empty, or they're not substantive, or they're not, you're getting lost in them. Your passions are kind of caught up in them. And the response to that, you're being damn elitist in saying that. These are, the really deep convictions. And then, of course, that really becomes, for groups like Christian nationalism, wow, now you're really treading into some really, really, really difficult things. So I don't know if that's any answer to your question.
It's a good answer.
It's just, what do academics do when they approach these things? And how do people really feel about them?
Yeah, please.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cintron, for the presentation. I think the question I'm about to ask is at least in part a reflection of that ivy tower. Yeah. But I'm hoping that it is grounded at some point, right? And so the question goes something like this. You tracked back and forth between the concept of democracy and the concept of modernity very quickly.
Yes, I do.
And it seemed as though you were almost conflating the two.
Yes.
So I'd like you to kind of tease out what you meant by both of those terms, at least in part because one history of modernity suggests that democracy is a late act, right? That it's a late modernity, kind of late capitalist obsession that has emerged most certainly, you know, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and throughout the 20th century. So if that's the case, right, then the resentments that you're describing, the kind of conflicts that you're describing, may in fact not be inherent to modernity over the long term, but is really inherent to modernity since the 1930s, the 1920s. And so can you just kind of help me understand how you're understanding those concepts?
Yeah.
And where the resentment's really coming from there?
Yeah, this is such a fantastic question, and I'm sure that my answer is not really adequate to the question itself. But I think you're absolutely right. I think in this particular talk, there's a really very quick kind of confluence in there between democracy and modernity. I think, you know, I'm particularly interested in that. Well, there's a variety of moments that I'm really interested in. I'm interested in Hobbes as an earlier kind of a figure. I'm interested in the notion of the social contract, for instance. I'm interested in how that kind of begins to play itself out, and so on. And that's not modernity yet. And yet, it's beginning to point to things. Because among other things, it's saying, okay, so here we have a war of all against all. How can we solve this problem? Well, let's have a strong state. You know, let's have the Leviathan. But let's also have let's also set aside our passions in some fashion or another. So if we take that eventually becomes a terrific ideal within democracy in terms of the tolerance that we're supposed to have. And you know it better than I probably, Rawls, when he says we have to create that kind of veil of ignorance in some fashion or another, we have to push our passions back if we're going to save this apparatus called modernity and democracy and all of that sort of stuff. We're going to have to restrain our deepest convictions in some fashion or another. So now the question is, okay, so let's say that Hobbes launches, or is one of the figures that kind of launches that possibility, and then it begins to crystallize more and more and more. If we're really going to realize this in the 19th century and the 20th century, we really have to take seriously that state cannot be mixed in with religion, so you really have to hold back your religious convictions. And then what happens? Well, then we have a certain version of religion that comes up and says, there is no space for me in your liberal secularism. That is elitism. And that becomes, it's like the whole thing has undermined itself, you know, at that point. So I'm going to grant you that I kind of muddy the waters very quickly, but I am trying to recover a little bit of integrity on my part and to say, you know, there is something within that Hobbesian claim of a war of all against all, and we have to do something. We have to address that problem, and we do. We come out with formulas for addressing that problem, and Rawls kinds of contingents, the great liberal theorist, you know, and so on and so on. And we know the heritage of that through Hume, through the whole set of, you know, apparatuses that we get at. But then we kind of confront, we can't. And so then, is this still modern? Is this still democratic? And I don't know if that answers your question, but at least, you know, that's a little road, you know, traversing the difficulty of the question that you're asking.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much, Ralph.
Oh, hi, Keith.
I wanted to ask about the role of the empirical, because as you were discussing, you're saying that, you know, you have these claims from the left, from the right, and that they're irresolvable, really. Like, in other words, they both have weight as truth claims. But in the slide you showed by Blow,
Yeah.
And in vote tallies, aren't those empirical things that weigh against an argument or for an argument? You know, like in other words, generally 6 people would say, we're being attacked. You know, we're saving democracy because we're under attack, presumably because an election was stolen from us.
Right.
But if empirical data doesn't show that,
Yeah.
then we can make an argument,
Right.
we can make a judgment about it.
Yeah, right. If I'm following the argument, Keith, there may be multiple answers to your argument, and I don't know if this works or not, but let's try Ann Phillips, you know, in some fashion or another. Now, when I watch cable news, I don't know about the rest of everybody here, I literally do try to switch back and forth and move around. MSNBC sometimes just completely irritates me. Fox News almost always irritates me, but every now and then Tucker Carlson says something and my mouth just drops. CNN is always restrained, or much more restrained. But anyway, what I saw with MSNBC was the attempt to kind of like mobilize that, you know, that sort of argument in some fashion or another, that this was an attack on democracy. And it was particularly coming from MSNBC. Now, those other folks, are we, you know, they may have the wrong information. They may have the wrong view of things. How do we treat those wrong views? How do we treat them? How do we treat those people? I thought that MSNBC was in the business of demeaning all of those folks for having false beliefs. Can we literally remove false beliefs from people? And when they do have these false beliefs, do we still acknowledge a kind of unconditional equality to them? Maybe that's too idealistic, but that really kind of appeals to me in some fashion or another. And maybe it appeals to me because I really do think of ethnography in this kind of like, not just as a methodology, but as an ethical relationship by which I come to the world, and I hope I literally can listen to everyone and find out where they're coming from. And I am disturbed, quite frankly, because I think this is part of the sophistic tradition as well. I remember encountering graduate students at some point or another in which they told me, there is no way that I want to deal at all with the militia groups that you have dealt with. I think that's wrong. I think if there's something really crazy out there, we should run towards it and find out what it's about. Harriman, Robert Harriman, Bob Harriman, who you know also, made a joke about me one time. And he said, Ralph, the Nazis will be hanging you by the neck and chopping off your arms, and you'll still be asking questions. What do you believe? And why are you cutting off my leg? Because of this belief. I mean, that's how much I am committed to. I mean, Harriman was making a joke, but he's really kind of right. I mean, I think there's a kind of like an ethical commitment. So I don't know if I can really hang on to it. At what point does egalitarian equality just simply fall apart? It does. Somebody comes in here with a pistol, I'm not for it. And I'm not asking questions, I'm going to try to do something. But, up until that final moment in which it just simply becomes impossible, I literally am ethically driven to try to understand.
Well, there's lots more questions. Yeah, let's take a couple more.
Hi there, thank you so much for your talk. I want to follow up on your comment about the ethical imperative of ethnography, and I hope this question about methodology doesn't take us too far from your topic today, but I can't miss this opportunity to ask you in particular this question. I find appealing what you say about the ethical dimensions of ethnography in terms of listening, and that it isn't just a methodology, that there is the ethical imperative. I'm wondering if you could tease out a little bit more, though, how do you see that as distinct from the kind of listening that you might do in a type of particularly attentive reading through, say, rhetorical criticism or archival analysis? Like, what is it about ethnography that you think enables a different kind of listening than you can do through reading?
That's a really kind of wonderful question. Ethnographers often like to talk about the body as a research tool. And, you know, the body encounters another body. You know, the body encounters a speaking being in some fashion or another. And that raises all kinds of problems, doesn't it? Because you have to figure out a way to make a bridge. And that can be really hard. I'll create I'll speak an example. I'm up in northern Wisconsin. I hear about a person who is white and is a potential conspiracy theorist. I run.
But maybe not in the direction I would run.
I know. Plato has a phrase about, I can't remember the exact phrase now. Oh yeah, he says, somebody who has an idea, I run towards them because I want to know what the idea is. And I kind of feel the same way. In this particular case, I make an initial telephone call and talking very briefly, and the person says, you're from a university, and what you want to do right now is make fun of me. Eventually, you're going to take whatever I say, and you want to make fun of me, and you're going to print it. That's what you're really interested in, isn't it? Okay, so I have to defend myself in some fashion or another. I mean, that's the body encountering the body, right? So the body has some presumptions about who you are. I have some presumptions about who that other body is. And somehow or another, we're going to have to negotiate that difficulty. Reading a text, archives, etc., doesn't seem to be faced with that kind of a problem. So what I like about ethnography then is that constant adjustment to a kind of chaotic set of moments that are just popping up in front of me. And I'm trying to figure out what the next question is, which will allow something to occur, and I don't know what the next question will be. So I like to be thrown into the middle of that almost chaotic scene.
You know, I think that's about all the time we have for questions. So if you want to step up and ask another question, that'd be great. Otherwise, can you join me in once again thanking Dr. Cintron?
Thank you.
I'm going to step down.